Three, two, one, here we go. RAINMAN'S Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey, everybody. So Rain Man got another great interview for you today with Kevin Buchanan. But before I get into that, if you are part of RAINMAN'S Take community, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. If you are new to the show, welcome. I know you're going to love the content. So if you could just watch as much of this as possible. That way it helps me with the YouTube algorithm and it helps us get this program out to more people. So thank you very much for being a part of RAINMAN'S Take. And right now I want to introduce my guest, Kevin Buchanan. And I wanted to have Kevin on because as most of you know, and as some of you probably don't know, springtime is lacrosse season, the sport of lacrosse. And I played in college, and Kevin played both in college and in the professional leagues. And so I wanted to have him on because it's a perfect time for it to talk about what it was like to play in a professional lacrosse league. And not only that, but also to give me a little bit of a background about what it was like to be part of something that was really kind of brand new when he first got into it. So kind of we'll talk all about that. We may throw a little bit of competition and maybe some betting in there because my Johns Hopkins Blue Jays are playing his Ohio State Buckeyes in 2
Big Ten battle.
Exactly. So without further ado, I want to introduce Kevin Buchanan. Kevin, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Ryan. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of your backstory lacrosse-wise and up until kind of when you retired from the PLL. So kind of give me that, and then we'll go into it from there.
Yeah, I can give you a quick rundown. Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, which is kind of a hotbed for lacrosse. I live in New England now, here on the South Shore of Mass. It's like it's hockey to Massachusetts, lacrosse is to Baltimore, very much. Yeah, so I was born and raised there. I started playing at a very young age. I went to a prominent high school in the Towson area, which is known for some really great lacrosse, called Calvert Hall All Boys Catholic School. I was fortunate then to get recruited to go play in college. I was fortunate to play at Ohio State. So I was a Buckeye. I played there and I graduated in 2008. And then I was fortunate to get drafted in both pro leagues at the time. Those pro leagues are relatively small. The first pro league was Major League Lacrosse, which is the traditional field game that we see here as we drive around our neighborhoods in the States. So big nets playing outdoors. So I was fortunate to be drafted there by Major League Lacrosse, and I ended up in Los Angeles as my first team, which is now a defunct team, no longer exists. And then in the fall of 2008, I got drafted in the National Lacrosse League, which is a league that plays indoors, plays mostly hockey rinks. So it's a very Canadian style game, which is basically what they play. It's a 5-on-5, very similar to hockey, smaller nets, and the goalies are much more padded than the outdoors.
Yeah, very similar to hockey. Very similar to hockey.
Yeah, like all the greats, Gretzky and stuff like that, you can talk to. That is what they know, Adam Oates and all those guys. That was kind of when the ice melted in Canada. That's what they parlayed into going into the summer. So yeah, they're real well versed in it. So I never had played that game, but I was fortunate. Like kind of my skill set was able then to kind of fit well into that game. So then I ended up playing for quite some time. I played all the way up until the summer of 2020. So it's about like 12 or 13 seasons. For the field game, the MLL, I played majority of my years here in Boston with the Boston Cannons. And then towards the end, one of my teammates, Paul Rabel, who's kind of like the Michael Jordan of lacrosse, if you will, decided to go off on a venture of his own called the Premier Lacrosse League, the PLL, And that inaugural season was in 2019. And I decided to follow Paul and play in that inaugural season. I was able to play with Team Chaos for two years. One of those years being in the bubble in Utah, given the pandemic, COVID. And then the NLL, same thing. NLL, a little bit more of a suitcase, just given some of the variables within the leagues that we deal with, small leagues, kind of teams come and go. But I played for many years in that. And then I was also blessed to be able to play on the national team. So I played on, U.S. team in 2014, and then nice. I played in a couple of the U.S. national teams for box lacrosse. So, yeah, I've run the gamut. It's been a great run. It's a ton of fun. But as I got old and I started playing against guys that were born in 2000.
Oh, yeah, I know.
I was like, wait a second. Yeah. I was like, you were born in 2000? It was time for me to put or close my book and then kind of step away from the game from a playing perspective.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's time is undefeated.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Yeah, Frank always wins, Brian. Always wins.
Exactly. All right, let's start from the beginning here, because this is actually what's so impressive about what Paul Rabel did with the Premier Lacrosse League. So let's go back to the MLL, which was the pro league, the more, like you were saying, the more traditional field game, and where cities had their own teams and they would travel to play. So. How was that? Was it essentially, because I know that what Paul's really trying to do at the PLL is get it to the point where the guys can actually make a pretty good living playing lacrosse in the PLL. Yeah. It wasn't that way in the MLL, was it?
No, it was terrible. From a wage standpoint, it was pretty bad. I mean, I think I want to say, this is funny numbers. I think like the rookie salary was like $7,000 for my first. It was peanuts. Yeah. Right? It was nothing. And I think, the league at that point, probably, I think it had been established I played in summer of 2008. So it'd probably been around for maybe 8 or 9 years. Okay. And it is what it was. And those guys were trying to establish it, and it had morphed probably, when you look in the 90s to, they had a like club lacrosse was kind of big, and that kind of took the next step into the MLL. But yeah, it was something that, someone couldn't live off of. Yeah. And when I first started in it, there was a good majority of guys that were not only playing, but they were working full time as well. Yeah. And I very much did that same, and kind of did that my whole year. Now, I am the same class as Paul, so I just ended up lining up. Paul is a little bit different, as Paul became $1 million man in lacrosse, right? So Paul was able to do a great job of marketing himself, branding himself, and then his likeness was able to really push him into creating and generating a ton of revenue for himself through partnerships with brands, whether it be Warrior, Red Bull, Bose, whatever it may be. But it was, in the beginning, it was pretty strapped. Yeah. It was pretty strapped. But we did it for the love of game. Love of the game.
Exactly. And I always tell people when I try to explain a little bit about lacrosse, because for the longest time it was very niche. It was really kind of the Northeast United States down to Maryland. And so basically from Maryland up to New England, including New York. And so it was very, very niche market. I mean, the game basically started there with the Native Americans.
You got it.
And that's kind of where everything kind of happened. But within the last 25 years, it is just mushroomed to now you get kids who are playing in the Division I leagues from every state in the country, which is awesome.
It's awesome to hear, Ryan. It's awesome to hear. When you hear some kid that's like, I'm from Texas. This kid's from Texas, or this kid's from Utah. You're like, this is awesome. Yeah. It's amazing.
And so
it's great.
So I tell people, I say the trajectory of lacrosse is very similar to what the trajectory of the professional soccer league here in the United States.
Yes.
It took probably 30 years for the professional lacrosse or professional soccer league to get to where it is today, which is actually now a legit, they're on television, they're bringing in international guys. So it's a legit league. And I guess the question is, obviously it takes a long time. And so the guys that were running the MLL, was that what they were trying to do, or were they just happy that it was as small as it was, and then it was just, did they have goals of making it bigger, and it was just such a unknown sport that it really didn't have any legs back then. Is that what you think happened?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of, from my point of view, Brian, I can kind of give you my recap. So coming out of school in 2008, as I mentioned, I got drafted to the LA Riptide. The next year, they ended up basically kind of folding off some of the Western teams. They had they had a team out of San Francisco, team out of LA, and they ended up folding another team in Chicago and really condensing down. And I think we almost got down to like 6 or 7 teams. So I don't think it was necessarily that they didn't, want to grow it. I think they were trying to grow it, but I don't know if they were really trying. I don't know if they were really connecting with the right partners that really wanted to be invested in it. I think the people that they were bringing on were people that were kind of half in, half out. Like, maybe this ownership group, their kids played, so they were like, oh, this would be cool, and we can own it, and it's relatively cheap money. And then after a while, they just were like, all right, this is kind of just burning cash, if you will, and not. This isn't really sustainable and something, is not really going to come in the long run of this. And eventually just that flair maybe, or that coolness of owning a team kind of just fades. So it kind of just went away. So I think they ended up condensing down, and then, those condensed ownerships, I think, were pretty vested in it. And I think so towards 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, I feel like the players in itself had really elevated it. And I think, Paul was a lot about helping that, especially as well as he did for himself and stuff. And I think so you get a lot of new college guys coming out and kind of seeing how Paul is kind of making this in lacrosse. Kyle Harrison was a little bit before that too, the STX man, kind of making himself as well in lacrosse. So it was starting to see these were a couple people that were able to do it and do it themselves in its entirety. So I think the players started almost seeing it as a little bit more mature of a league, and maturing themselves in how they view the league and prepping themselves for the league and competing in the league. Also, I think that we had also kind of filled in the areas that we were in. Brian, were just good. Yeah. We were in Chesapeake, which is kind of like the in Annapolis. We were in Boston, which was really heavy. Certain areas we had really navigated to, which were hotbeds of lacrosse, and then kind of sustained a base. Yeah. But what I noticed, and I think Paul probably noticed too, is that around the 14, 15, 16 range, we had kind of known. It kind of was evident that maybe the MLL didn't have. Maybe the entrepreneurial spirit or the innovation to say, hey, what can we do differently in a really tough environment? Sports is it's grueling, so difficult. What can we do to kind of put our sport on the map? And, because again, I think a lot of the folks that, were coming into the league and they were selling on it was kind of what you were talking about, the youth sport and lacrosse in itself. The participation of it mushrooming, it was getting huge, and it still is growing and huge. But that wasn't, that was a great selling point and a talking point to it. But, after they got up and running, whether that actually was coming to fruition or not is a completely different story.
And so, no, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that, I think at that, kind of when we saw that, and I think, Paul's a great ambassador for us. My personal opinion is because he's so vested in the sport and wants to see the sport, to the next level, because it's a great game. It's a ton of fun to play. Yeah. I think he was kind of like, hey, this is, we had established a couple things. One of the things that we had established with the PLL was the Players Council. I sat on it, and they were just adverse to a lot of the ideas that we were kicking back or trying to come or trying to be able to work with the players to make them a little bit more professional, become more full-time. Because if they become more full-time, they then spend a lot more time, working out, being conditioned physically, which then ups the game, so forth and so on and everything.
But what comes first? What comes first is the chicken.
Exactly.
And the egg.
Chicken and egg, right?
Tough spot to be in. Yeah, it is. And that's where it takes that entrepreneur, like you were talking about. Maybe it was the old MLL, the ownership, just thought that the game was going to be enough. And maybe in today's world, it potentially could be, get more teams around the country. But it seems like, and this is where me looking in from the outside, obviously having played lacrosse and like you were
Yeah.
talking about Paul, Paul brought Hopkins back to its old glory in the early 2000s when he was there, and he just sort of just springboarded that into what he's doing now. And so I think it sounds like you guys were all in the MLL thinking, okay, we should be doing X, Y, and Z, and we could be doing this. Is that when he started to really be like, okay, I need to start making this thing happen?
Yeah, I mean, Paul's a smart kid on his own, right? And I think he's got a lot of the attributes that there's no surprise that he is as successful as he is. So you're absolutely right? So I think he was like kind of scratching his head, like, hey, I'm pushing on the league. I want to make this thing bigger. Obviously, it's in my best interest to make the league bigger because it also, and I don't think Paul's thinking this selfishly, but hey, if the bigger the league, the bigger I can market it myself and more runway I have.
Yep.
So I think, he, and then also with his brother, Mike is a former Dartmouth football player, athlete himself. After he got out of school, he got into very much the entrepreneurial space, was around a lot of VC-backed companies. So just kind of really knew that space, how to navigate it, how to understand it.
Right.
And then I think he was feeding, and Paul and him were kind of bouncing a lot off the back and forth with each other. And then, so I think it kind of became to that where it hit the wall and just said, hey, you know what? Why don't we just start our own league?
Yeah.
Right. And, we'll be innovative and we'll do a bunch of stuff that, the MLL is not really willing to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, we can talk about that stuff.
Yeah.
The problem that you see.
What was that divorce like? Was it pretty equitable? Did the guys that were running the MLL at the time they saw the writing on the wall? I mean, because
I think they were blindsided.
Really?
I think they were pretty blindsided by it. Yeah, Brian. I think they were pretty blindsided by it. I mean, if there's anyone that could have done it, obviously Paul could have done it, and he was the guy to do it. I mean, just given that he was full-time lacrosse and able to dedicate the time to it. But I think they were pretty blindsided. Yeah. And I think that, the other thing too that, Paul was put in a really tough position as well is Jim Davis, who owns New Balance, right, was one of the marquee guys in the MLL in terms of funding the league. Gotcha. And Paul was a Warrior athlete, a New Balance Warrior athlete. So, that's tough. Here you are, one of your main guys is your main lacrosse player, your main athlete, one of your sponsored guys is basically launching a league that, compete against a league that you're completely vested in.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it puts Paul in a tough spot, and Paul's got a great film that kind of lays out his journey. It's called Fate of the Sport. ESPN sponsors it, or it's on their platform. So you definitely check that out. People are more interested and gives a little back in kind of a backdoor journey to kind of launching the league and such. But yeah, so I think they were just super surprised. And then, what's kind of interesting is that when Paul talked to me about it and trying to get players to come over, that guys were more hesitant than I would have expected.
They were comfortable with the MLL. They thought that had a future, and
I mean, and I think an MLL certainly went on the offense or defense, and on kind of creating FUD, certainty and doubt around it, and that fear around that. Hey, Paul's starting to try this league; it's going to flop. There's not backing around it. Blah blah blah. And then guys were kind of getting cold feet in that perspective. Yeah. And a lot of times people don't like change, and like, hey, that's what they're used to. That's what we're comfortable. It's been established, and the MLL at that time had been around for 19, 20 years, right? It wasn't thriving, but it existed.
Yeah.
I always remember that. I was surprised by that, and I know Paul was like had everyone on speed dial, and that ultimately was like trying to manage the relationships and people's day-to-day feelings about whether they wanted to come over. Or not.
Interesting. Yeah. And it sounds like he did it right in terms of setting it up. He had all the TV contracts in place. He had a bunch of other things in place so that you guys and that right off the bat, that gives it an air of legitimacy when like NBC is showing it or
heck yeah.
So it's so having and it sounds like he was probably able to do that because of his already established persona in that space.
Yeah. I mean, I think he knew a lot about about brand and reach and likeness and with all him personally, right?
Yeah.
And that's like that very much is a lot about what these sports leagues are about, right?
Yeah.
I'm not into the finer detail of them, and I won't say that I know all the intricacies about them, but I think that's largely a lot about what it's about, right?
Yeah.
Is having an amazing brand and then being able to, sell sponsorships and want other brands to attach their brand with your brand.
Yeah.
So I think, Paul was in a really good space because he did that very much around himself. And so, he was ready for the league to do it.
Yeah.
And I think Mike had a lot of the business, not that Paul doesn't, and he does, but I think, Mike brought probably maybe a little bit more of the operational sense and had worked in the entrepreneurial space and running startups and companies.
Yeah.
And, when you're going to fund and get funded by, certain individuals or companies, they want to see that experience, right? That someone's done this before and such, so that they're, feel their money or their investment is going to be
exactly. All right, so let's go. Let's fast forward now. It's 2019. You make the jump. You make the jump over to PLL. Then it starts. So what were the main? Because there are some significant differences to how that league is set up in relation to how a traditional sports league is set up. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, Paul. So the idea had been bounced back, and I remember like one of my coaches, Dave Huntley, always talked about it kind of being like more of a tour-based model. So that's probably the number one thing that you get, right? It's a tour-based model. It is not geographically bound, and the teams don't represent a particular city. So in the beginning, in the first year, basically what he did, and it was pretty cool. And I think they were, instead of trying to have a draft, right, and just say, hey, let's get coaches and then let's get them just to jump in and start randomly picking players, rather than just having this random expansion league where like all this just jumbled mixed bag of players kind of come together. They actually developed like characters a little bit, and they developed these teams and attributes or personas or characteristics around a particular team. So, Paul was originally on the Atlas, which is kind of more of like the big bruiser guys, all, if you take a look at their roster, they were all like the massive dudes standing tall at, 6'2", 6'3", Scotty Rogers the net, you know what I mean? U6 at midfield shooting a zillion miles an hour, right? All these big guys, right? And they were the Bulls, right? I got drafted to the Chaos, which was a little bit more of like the slasher style Canadian influence team, which, I had spent a lot of time in the NLL. I was one of the few Americans that spent a lot of time in the NLL, played up front, and they almost deem me as like almost to the point where they deem me as a Canadian, which I'm not. But I got to mix that. And those guys are, the guys that kind of play fast, a lot of pick action, a lot of cutting off balls, spot feeding and stuff like that. Yeah, so they did a really great job in one, designing and creating teams with personality. And then they started to group guys around, hey, these players that have either played a very similar style, come from a similar background, or maybe even played in college together or went through the same program. So, you could take the Whip Snakes, like 80% of the team was Maryland guys. And they'd all played for the same Maryland coach out in Maryland. So they'd all been through very much the same system. Yeah. So that was like, that was pretty epic in kind of how they did that and broke that down, very different than traditional, just like, hey, you're this mascot representing this city. Right. So pretty cool there. Yeah. Yep.
No, continue. Sorry, I'm interrupting. Sorry. So
no, that's great. So really cool there. And then again, back to it, we were not geographically bound. We were tour based. Yeah. Right. So here you go. You have these teams. You're creating these teams with certain players that have certain attributes and personalities, and putting them and associating with them with all the different teams, and kind of creating a little bit different of a vibe for each. And then they move into the tour base. So rather than basically having one game going on in multiple cities on a given weekend, we're going to come in and Paul and PLL are going to activate on site, and they're going to try to activate around the whole weekend, right? They're going to try to do a bunch of stuff on the weekend, very similar to, obviously we're talking here and going on down at Augusta, right?
Yeah.
All the PGA guys come into Augusta. They're playing in the Masters. There's a ton going on in the Masters, and that's it. That's what's going to happen there, and then we're going to leave, right? And then we're going to move on to a different city. And I think, if you look at our sport, Brian, and the way the demographic that plays our sport, and with something that's obviously rapidly changing, which is amazing. But a lot of times I think you see, or the perception of lacrosse is people, or, like a prep school kid playing lacrosse, a kid that has good financial means and is able to do things, right? And I think kind of looking at it, a tour-based model, that is there a lot of kids do in this instance. And again, like, it's rapidly changing, which is the best thing for the sport. It's amazing. But it's like, are those people have means to do a lot of things and do a lot of entertainment? Yeah. You know what I mean? Whether that be going to the beach, playing golf themselves, playing tennis, whatever it may be, right? Traveling, going to the islands, boating, whatever it is, right? So are they truly committed to like being and committing themselves, especially given the fact that we compete in the summer, right? Giving their summer weekends up to go to 6 to 7 home games at a particular given location.
Interesting.
No different than golf, right? Like those guys, people that go to the Masters, they love it. But like, I mean, is that guy, if Tiger Woods played around at his home club, every weekend, would he go see him? I don't know. Probably not, because he'd be like, I'm going to play golf myself.
I did not think of that, because to be perfectly honest with you, when I first heard about PLL, I'm more of a traditionalist in the sense that I wanted it to be like soccer, where Boston has a team, San Diego has a team, and it never occurred to me to think about it the way you just explained it. And the golf is the perfect analogy.
That's great.
Interesting.
It's great.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, that's kind of how I saw it and how I take it. But that's the perfect analogy. It's like, guys, like, I mean, if Tiger comes into town, or Phil and them come into town, like, and they played Augusta in the Masters, like, I live in Charleston, or I live in Georgia or Atlanta or whatever. I'm going to come into town and check them out. But other than that, like, I'll probably be swinging them myself. I'm not going every weekend.
So it starts.
Yeah.
Out,
So
go.
Yeah. So we go to the tour-based model, and I think obviously, you can get into, how well the PLL launched all their different things, right? Like in terms of the rollout and building excitement to it, announcing all the different cities, how the players rolled out how we rolled out the teams and stuff, activating on social media, which I can talk to too as well, which is I think a very much a cornerstone of the PLL. So just really well executed, but very different and from what we were used to, right? Of like, hey, we're playing against in certain geographical locations, team based, city based.
What has the reception been like?
I think it's been great. I mean, I think so. I mean, I really do. I mean, if you take a look at the crowd, I think the MLL really was so focused on kind of very much the youth, and it was seen as like a youth game, or, the people that were going to these games were, kids, like the youth, right? Yep. Where I think you go to the PLL games now, you see everyone, right? And I think like you see kids that are in college, post-college, they're pumped up they're wearing, PLL jerseys, right? And I think it's like legitimized it a little bit there and kind of created a little bit more, I don't know how to describe it, but it's created a little bit like around what the NFL has created, and it has, right? You have like grown adults that are like painting their faces. Like that.
That's awesome, because how long is the league? Like how long is the season? How many weekends do you guys do this?
Yeah, so it depends, right? Like it depends when you get into, like, whether you get into playoffs, and there's some other stuff, obviously training camp and how long you're playing. Yeah. And I think my original was like 10 games. It was 10 weekends. Okay. But then you tack on, and then you take off a couple weekends here and there. It starts around May time frame. Those guys start competing towards the end of May. In training camp and stuff like that, and they really get rocking and rolling in June, and then June, July, August is kind of like the mainstay of the season, and then they compete for the championship.
Okay. Now, this is going to be the interesting part of that tour model, and that is, so Chaos, those guys all weren't in the same area. So how did you guys practice? How did you work out? Talk to me about the behind the scenes of an athlete in the PLL.
Yeah, so it's difficult. I think the key. So from a workout standpoint, it's a self-maintenance league.
Okay, so it's all
which is really difficult, and no one's watching over your shoulder, right? That, hey, are you doing the necessary lifts? Are you doing the necessary stretching? Making sure your pliability, flexibility is there. Are you doing the necessary conditioning? Are you getting your stick in your hand? And that was through the MLL too, Brian, right? Like, and that's why you see some of the athletes that maybe aren't that driven to keep themselves accountable or continue, like, get outside of college where you have your strength coach that's just beating down the door, or your coach, like, where are you, at practice? Like, now it is all on you. So I think it does. You'll start to see the athletes that maybe aren't as committed as maybe they thought they were, or, if they don't have as much discipline to make sure that they're doing stuff. So that's all self-maintenance.
Yeah.
In terms of us practicing, I mean, we get, I think where the teams do the best is if you continue. I mean, this is no different than any other pro league. If you try to keep guys consistent, years, the seasons, and then you get the right players and the right personalities to mesh together, which ultimately creates a good unit and team and effective. But our training camp would be a couple days, a couple weekends before the season. We would get a ton of reps in there and get a really understanding of what's going on there. Brian, at this point, if you can't catch and throw and shoot, you're not playing at this level. I mean, like, the talent level of these guys is insane. Yeah. Like, I mean, if just go to, and maybe not, I mean, you can get into a game earlier and watch the guys warm up, but you go to a practice and every single guy from, top down to your best scorer to your close defenseman, and even your goalie, they can just stand at 12, 15 yards and just ping a corner. Yeah. Consistently. Yeah. It's just like, ding, 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 ding. Yeah. I mean, you just should see warm-ups. It's just like, just rattling top rights, top lefts, just pipe in. I mean, so, those guys, they're all really, really skilled. It's like the fine nuances, right? Yeah. And then most of the stuff is like, people have played all the different schemes and stuff like that. So, and it's a big flow game too, Brian, as you know, you played. Yeah. And I think with the changes in the rules created this flow even more. So it's even more like probably like a hockey type flow, right? Like, there's a lot of bounces. It's not overly scripted. It's a lot about sports principles and flowing in the right direction, in the right way. Yeah. So, like, having all those X's and O's and then all that, like, very coordinated practice time, probably isn't as beneficial. Yeah. And then do you guys have like a team Zoom call or anything like that before a weekend, or? Yeah, for sure. So you had, it was fortunate, like, technology was on our side, right? Like, you could connect via Zoom, you'd have meetings, obviously emails and everything, text messages. We all had our group meet text messages, boom, guys firing things off, emailing out like, hey, here's the game plan. Here are the guys that we want to lock down. Here's their strengths. Here's their weaknesses. Yeah, all that stuff. Not to mention a lot of these guys, I mean, we all play with each other. Mostly seen these guys, no different than any other pros we have. You've seen these guys in college for the most part, right? Like, their tendencies, what they're good at. You've seen them on TV. So, and then, you can watch other games. All the games are recorded and everything. So, if you're a defensive guy or, offensive guy, maybe you want to get an understanding of the goalie and clip and stuff like that. You take a look at that. Yeah. That's no problem. Yeah. Interesting. Very disciplined a lot of that self-maintenance. Yeah. And that's actually surprising, because I assume, because one of the things that Paul, if I understand it correctly, one of the things that Paul really wanted to do was have it to the point where guys could actually make a living just playing lacrosse. Is that accurate? I mean, obviously that's the goal. Yeah. Are we there yet? Where are we in terms of that? So I would say that it's very close, if not happening. So I think, from a wage perspective, Paul has brought it up very significantly. And I think too, you got to look at it, if you have a contract of, and these aren't millions of dollars contracts, but if you have a contract of $50,000 and, that's kind of 3 months of your time, 4 months of your time, it's not that bad, right? Yeah. Like, all right, so you worked half the year.
Yeah.
So if you roll that forward, that's like making $120 maybe. So not only do they, so whatever their contract is, and I think there's, but again, the league minimum he brought way up, right? It's into the 20s or low 30s at the very least. And then also they've done a bunch of stuff, right? And I think Paul, going back to a lot of fundamentally how he was able to make a lot of money with his likeness and partnerships with brands, he's been able to get guys, a lot of activations around some of the brands that, the PLL partners with, right? So, whether that be, I think at one point we were Bose, and then, whether that be Vineyard Vines or Athletic Brewing, all that stuff, right? And being able to get those guys linked up, get sponsorships for those. So I think you see that. You just see more and more guys now, like the guys that when I first started, Brian, I was talking to you about, like I was working and playing. Those guys are less and less and less. Like it's almost like those guys are almost non-existent anymore.
Well,
the guys that are playing,
that's what's going to make the league. That's what's going to make the league better, because the talent is just going to go through the roof.
For sure. Like those guys are all focused a lot. I would probably say 90+% of the guys are now only focused on playing lacrosse. And if they don't play lacrosse, if they're, and they're supplementing income, not only this league, but they're supplementing with playing in the indoor league, right? The NLL, right? So they're getting paid there, getting paid in the PLL. Then they're getting some stuff on top, maybe with some sponsorships or doing some branding stuff. And then they get into, like, some of them do their own camps and clinics and help out the club teams and the U teams. And, you get money there. And then before you know it, you're feeling pretty solid. And having a good time and doing what you love.
That's interesting, because two things about that. One, the other thing I also heard about the league is super heavy, and I think obviously the reason is because they're built up the teams as personalities, and then inside those teams are the personalities. So the social media exposure is huge, and so I'm sure guys are probably making money off that to a certain extent.
Absolutely. I mean, when you get visible, I mean, that's obviously social media is huge in terms of advertising nowadays, right? Like it's a new sector for a lot of these brands, or relatively, if you take a look at, last couple decades, right? In the 90s, this sector didn't exist of like putting ad dollars in Instagram and social media. But I mean, that's huge, right? Because if you're a brand and you want to activate around a guy that, plays across, there's a very specific audience that is following that guy. And then absolutely. And if you're trying to reach that audience, that's a perfect person to be able to get in front. And ultimately, he could be influential in your brand to his follower base. And I think so, getting to like that, I mean, very much Paul revolutionized that. And I think they built around a lot about the PLL being very fast forward in the way that the world now digest content of sports, right? Like he understood, and if you look at the PLL's Instagram, right? Instagram, Twitter, whatever, Snap, I mean, just go across all of them, right? There is so much content on that. It's because so many of the kids nowadays are actually absorbing majority of the content that way, right?
Interesting.
And parents in the same way, like everyone, because they're on the go, right? And they're just looking and scrolling through, and you're able to catch it. Probably not as much anymore people sitting down and just like, hey, I'm just going to watch 2 hours worth of sports, right? It's like, it's becoming less and less. Maybe one game, but they want to catch up on the other games and what happened, or catch the highlights. And we see that in the way that, the different user interfaces that we see with, in the space now. I mean, I have YouTube TV. It's like you can turn on a game and it'll just say, hey, do you want to catch up with key plays? Right? Like I don't even have to watch the whole game. Like if I come in the middle of it, it'll just give me the first two periods with like the key plays that happened. Awesome. Right? And that's YouTube doing it. It's like, I was like, oh, you're right. You might as well just catch up live, and they'll show you 5-10 plays, football, what happened. And then we see with baseball, right? Baseball just sped up their game. I think they have a pitch clock now.
Like 15 seconds. Crazy.
It's like get it going. And so Paul, they were smart. They changed the rules a little bit in terms of the PLL, where they shrunk the field a little bit. So it was a little bit tighter. There wasn't as much dead space in it. It's like you come right over. They took 10 yards out of the middle, if you think about it.
Wow.
You come right over, and you're in the action basically in two strides. they obviously got the arc. They shortened the game down, so the game's super tight. Where I think your broadcast can like be within maybe an hour and a half at the max. So it's super fast. Not a ton of whistles, like boom, boom, boom. They just keep it rolling, and it's like so much content just right in your face. And then they just level social media and getting and having reach that way tremendously.
Dude, it's just totally showing my age. I graduated Hopkins in '92, which is an eternity.
Okay. Not that long. I mean, Brian, basically Brian Kelly coached me at Calvert Hall. Joe Bresci coached me at Ohio State. Like those guys are, they're early '90 guys too. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. BK is a great friend of mine. I remember playing against Bresci.
Oh yeah. Yep.
But it's funny because, and I guess every old athlete in the barn talks about when I was younger, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And I constantly look back and I'm like, because the game has changed so much and the kids are, I mean, the Hopkins team, just use that as an example, and I'm sure Ohio State's the same way because they were huge like 4 or 5 years ago. Just they are big kids. Like eventually it's going to get to the point where eventually the game is going to take on more of that hockey physicality and just watching real big athletes run around and just bang into each other and do amazing things with their sticks.
Facts.
I often wonder what would it have been like with all of this social media around. I mean, obviously the experience would be totally different, and I probably, looking back on it, probably am glad that it wasn't around. But it's actually really cool to watch it. But I guess what I'm getting at with that, just being the old horse in the barn, is I never opened up my view to the stuff that you're talking about, which now that when you hear you talk about it, it makes perfect sense as to why to do something like that and why to take that path. And old guys like me who are afraid of the change are just going to be left behind because the game is moving forward and it's moving forward fast, which is awesome.
Yeah. No, it's great.
Yeah. Do you ever think it could get big enough where they could go back to that geographical format, or is that's just gone and never coming back?
In my opinion, I think they would be able to back down. I mean, I almost equate it to like a lot of the companies that start online, Brian, and then they back into brick and mortar stores. That's kind of how I view the PLL a little bit. Like they're basically building these big brands.
Yeah.
Whatever it may be, like in the virtual space and leveraging technology. And then basically once they get to the point where, hopefully they understand that they have enough brand awareness, they have enough revenue investment, like they can then be able to let that float and back that in.
Yeah.
I do. I think that'll happen. I think it will. I think it will come. And I think, another probably big piece of it too, Brian, which they'll struggle against is like, do they shift the season? It's probably one of the biggest battles that, like, do they shift it? Because I mean, right now you're playing through the summer, which, like, as I was talking about before, there's a lot going on. People are out, that's big vacation time and it's tough. It's like, do you shift up, right? Do you come in and say, hey, maybe the PLL should probably be starting now, right? Like college lacrosse is in full swing. We're mirroring that system, everyone's kind of in tune with the sport right now. The weather's changing up here. People are getting the itch to get outside.
Yeah.
Do you come in, start in April, go April, May, June, and then can you, obviously like kids up here in New England, we're in school until, 3 weeks in June, right? Yeah. So it's like people aren't really, we don't really get into it until like, probably July 4th, especially when it gets hot and really kicking off the summer. So do you get into that and just pull the season up and kind of have the cap July 4th weekend, maybe a little bit. And so that's probably a big decision that they'll have to make too down the road. But again, that the issue with that is then it moves into the NLL season, right? And there's a lot of crossover between guys. So then you start conflicting there.
Okay.
So that, I mean, I'm sure they'll be figuring out all that stuff kind of down the road. But yeah, I mean, I think eventually, hopefully they back in. And back into places. And Brian, I hope they back into the places, people with actual, and probably MLS would be a great one, is like, those stadiums are epic to play in. Like those venues are tremendous. You know what I mean? They're super intimate. The way that they're designed, right? The sideline is like right up against the front row. Obviously a little bit different than your football stadiums, because they have so much equipment on the sidelines. Like, when PLL played at Gillette, they still do. It's like you're like 30 yards off the sideline.
Yeah.
You're just kind of far away from the action. It's like, where the soccer stadiums, whether we played in Audi or the one out in San Jose or the one at Red Bull in New York, like, those are awesome. And they're grass fields and they're tremendous. There's no lines. It's really clean cut.
Very cool.
It'd be awesome to see if down the road you see some types of partnership with the MLS and the people that own those buildings, and kind of back into that, because those are great venues. Yeah.
Now, the PLL specifically, there's 6 teams?
So they've upped now. I think, I think there's 8 teams now.
Okay. And now, are each of those individually owned, or does PLL own them all? And just it's a traveling circus. They just take them.
So you got So PLL owns them all in its entirety.
Okay.
And actually, the league in itself, and and this is kind of slicing into the word I'd have to read up on, but the league in itself is owned a lot by the players.
Really?
So the league in itself. Yeah. So, like, for instance, I have stock in the PLL.
Okay.
So I own shares of the PLL. And that was very much how Paul wanted it to be set up.
Yeah.
Paul and Mike, when they kind of went on the journey, they wanted it to be for the players, by the players. So there is a big portion of the league, which is, owned by the players.
And now
yes, correct. You don't have individual franchise owners.
Gotcha. And now, you're out. You no longer play in the PLL, and obviously there's a bunch of guys in your similar situation. Does the PLL do anything like annually where the guys because you're all shareholders still, do they have like an annual shareholders meeting, both with the alumni and the actual? I mean, do they do something?
No, they do a good job. They're actually now that they're like, no, we don't do any shareholders meeting. I don't think I own that many shares. They're like, but they're starting now that they've gotten into it. They are starting, and they're starting to be in tune with the alumni, and kind of bring them back. And they do a lot of stuff where people are, because a lot of the alumni live in the certain cities that, they're visiting and stuff, and they comp tickets and get us to come and get us involved in it and stuff. So, given the league that, really they're embarking on, what is this, like their fifth or sixth season, right? Now that there's people have been kind of pulled, either retired out of the league, like myself, who played mostly in the MLL, but now, certainly trying to keep us involved and such, and which is awesome to see. And obviously, I'm sure that initiative will continue to grow as they continue to grow more of an alumni base.
Nice. Yeah. Dude,
and the one thing,
no, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the huge things too that they did too is, they started kind of a lacrosse Hall of Fame too at the pro level.
Okay.
So which is really great. And then they also have, they've created a lot of awards that are around specific guys. So they've done a really great job in that arena. It's kind of like, football does that, or like, whether it be the Heisman and stuff like that, all those, or, all that type of field. They have like different named guys that are, legends in our sport, like a Gary Gate, right? Yeah. Kind of has his own award. And they start to elect players each year to those. So I think that is, in a way, that very much ties in the alumni. And even though they didn't play in the PLL, feel vested as, their names being used on an annual basis for an award and electing a player.
Nice. What now? Yeah. So you got 8 teams in, let's just call it 30 guys. I don't know the numbers. 30 guys on each roster. So that's 240 guys. I imagine there's not many guys that are cycling out. So that when they're drafting new kids, I mean, is the draft that big, or it's
not crazy big.
Yeah.
It's tight. It's tight. I mean, and this really isn't that much different than the MLL too, Brian, and the NLL, the same thing. It's just tight. Yeah. There's not many seats on the bus. Yeah. And, you got to adapt quick, and the game's different, and the game's super fast. And, I think when you look at college, you know, you when I was playing in college, you might go up against a particular team and be like, all right, here's, you know, I was just using it because I'm an offensive player, defensive guy. All right, here's one defensive guy that's like their guy.
Yeah.
And he's solid, right? And he does a really good job. And then you kind of parlay and you get that into the PLL. It's like everyone on the roster, all their D guys are like the guy.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's so concentrated where, you know, college, all right, you got the guy. And then there's like, all right, well, the second guy has kind of dropped off. And then the third guy's even dropped off even more. And then if he gets a foul and the friggin' next guy comes in, he's like, you know what I mean? Like not these guys. Yeah. And like I said to you before, it's like, and not to mention, are these guys great positionally? Are they great, you know, from a physique standpoint? They're physical, they're aggressive, but also from a stick skill standpoint, all of them are awesome and amazing. They'll come down and they'll just poke a corner from 15 like nothing's wrong. Yeah,
which is awesome. And for people who, you know, this conversation is obviously tailored to people who understand the game because we're not really talking much about the game.
Yeah,
of lacrosse,
the basics.
Of lacrosse. But for people who don't understand or are not familiar with lacrosse, just think hockey and basketball combined in terms of flow of the game. There's the physicality of hockey, there's the fast breaks and all those things of basketball, zone offense, zone defense, man up, man down, like hockey. And so I tell people, think of those two sports kind of combined. And what I'm getting back to that comment I made a couple minutes ago about just the size of these kids. So you're starting to get the kids who played football and played hockey and, you know, in high school and probably could have, if they wanted to, probably gone and tried to play in college in those sports. So you're getting big athletic kids, which I think is just going to get the game. It's going to bring the game to that next level in terms of being popular amongst a wide swath of people.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I even saw, like, being at Ohio State and, you know, 2000, I was there between 2004 and 2008. I mean, I even saw from my own eyes the growth of the sport in Columbus and then the state of Ohio in itself. Like each year, because Ohio State was great at activating around and doing tournaments for the local community, and you could just see the numbers each year, more and more kids coming, and then like the level of talent that was coming is like, well, wow, this kid's legit. You know, from coming out of Ohio, and you're right. And then you know, you saw it too. And when I like the defensemen that I played in college, those guys are just towers. Yeah. Just monsters, like 6'2" plus, all of them, 215, 220, 225, just big dudes. So bigger the dude, the harder to move, I guess, huh? At least that's what I thought to myself.
Exactly. And what was I just had it. And this is what it's, and it's probably a good problem to have that I think Rabel's going to have to try to figure out soon. And that is with all the talent. So the game is the talent of the game is rising at the college level. So that means when all those seniors get ready to leave, what if all of them want to go and play in the PLL, you know, and there's such a finite number of spots in the PLL. Does that mean he starts opening it up and expanding it? And then are you going to be able, or will the PLL be able to still do the traveling circus, format with 16 teams or 20. I mean, so it's going to be very interesting to see how he handles the growth just by virtue of the talent that's coming up from underneath that will propel the game into a more popular space.
Yeah. All fair points. Yeah. It does. It's like, you're right. It gets to the point where, you know, if you do get to a point where you do have a dozen, 14, 16 teams, now are all those teams embarking on one city, or are you now embarking on two cities in a given week? Yeah. Right. You know, maybe some are hitting the West Coast, some are hitting the East Coast. I don't know, but that's interesting. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I hope that's a problem that Paul and Mike have to solve for in the future, because the growth has been great and the support has been there, and that's what's needed. But yeah, those would be for them all great problems to solve. To solve,
and that would be great for the sport, and that
it'd be amazing.
And add the other layer of, as he starts to be able to increase the amount of base pay that these kids are making, the more and more kids are going to want to get. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these next couple of years come out. But the last 4 or 5 years, it's been really cool to watch the transition. And and I'm really appreciative of your conversation today, because I was sort of like, I'm not sure I'm on board, but you explained it because but the way you explained it makes perfect sense to start bringing that game into the popular mindset. So
it's huge, and I hope for the success of it. I think they've done a great job, just the way that they communicate it, the vibe around it, the energy around it, all the different stories within the stories. I mean, I think there's so much great. And to your point, I hope it elevates the sport. And I think, if there is that big pro league, as people start to aspire to play in it, right, that then just pushes down into the NCAA, no different than we see college football and pro football, or college basketball and pro basketball, right? It's like, well, then it's that much more important to go to a top 10 school or top 10, 15 school. And, then people start getting even hyper competitive there. It just keeps going down. It just keeps funneling down. Whether that's good or not.
Yeah. So, very cool. Well, listen, Kevin, this was awesome, man. I really,
Brian,
really appreciate it. Yeah. And,
good chatting.
Yeah, no, and my Blue Jays are on a roll right now, so I'm excited. And we're actually gonna be back for homecoming next weekend when they play.
Oh, nice.
So I'm looking forward to that. So
go Bucks. Go Bucks.
There you go. You know what? You're a guest. I can let you say that.
Yes, that's right.
All right. Hey guys, it's the Rain Man. Thank you very much for watching. And if you are in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. Kevin Buchanan, talking professional lacrosse. I appreciate it, brother.
Thank you.
All right, guys, it's the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.